Hi there, and welcome back to another exciting edition of Mrs. Reef's Video Lectures. Today we're going to be talking about the development of England and France. And I'm sure that it's not 11 o'clock at night and you didn't put this off until the very last thing you had to do the night before it was due. So I expect that there's going to be a lot of exciting learning going on today. So we are going to be talking, as I said, about the development of England and France. Before we start talking about that, though, we need to do a little bit of background. And we need to go all the way back to 476. And if you remember, in 476, the ancient civilization of Rome fell. Remember, Rome controlled pretty much all of Europe up until that point. That left pretty much the entire continent of Europe unprotected. This led to decentralized governments. That is, there wasn't one government that protected all of the area that Rome used to. Couple this with the fact that you had invasions from the Vikings and from the Muslims. People started to turn to individuals who had their own personal militaries. This led to, you guessed it, the rise of feudalism. And this is what's really dominating Europe from about 800 until about 1300. But by the 12 and 1300s, things are starting to change. By the 12 and 1300s, we've had a number of crusades. And if you were listening when we talked about the crusades, none of them were successful. This led to a lot of issues, a lot of death, a lot of expenses, people starting to question the church. But it also led to an increase in trade. And as more people started to trade, you start to see the rise of cities again. People had moved out of the cities because they were dangerous. That's where people would start to invade. But not anymore. People are going there to trade. And this leads to a higher population in cities, bigger cities, and it leads to a rise of the middle class. This middle class no longer needed to look to these feudal lords. Plus, by the mid-1300s, you've had the plague, and people are starting to, well, they died. And that meant fewer people and more people had the ability to request higher pay in their jobs, which really just changed the dynamic of Europe during this time. So by the 12 and 1300s, feudalism is starting to decline. And this leads to new nation states. And two of those new nation states that we're going to be looking at today are England and France. So by the end of this video, I want you to be able to do two things. I want you to describe the rise of England and France as nations. So how did they become the nations that we know them today? And explain how individuals become part of the political process. That is, how do individual people start to become more involved in their government? So we're going to rewind a little bit, and we're going to go back to the early 800s and talk about the development of England. So in the early 800s, England is under the control of the Anglo-Saxons. And by 1086, a Danish king by the name of Canute conquered England. I know he has a funny name. So during the 800s and up to the 1600s, there's different groups of people that are actually controlling England. And then in January of 1066, a very important year, the King of England, King Edward, dies without an heir to the throne. That is, there's nobody there to come in and take over for him. And this is when William the Conqueror from Normandy invades. And Normandy is a region in northern France that had been captured and conquered by the Vikings, or the Normans. Now, William the Conqueror, he was Edward's cousin, so he tried to claim the throne. But the English didn't like the idea of this French guy coming in and taking them over. So on October 14th, 1066, again, important date, was the Battle of Hastings. And the Battle of Hastings was between the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans. William the Conqueror led the Normans, while an Anglo-Saxon who wanted the crown, a guy by the name of Harold Godwinson, was controlling and fighting for the Anglo-Saxons. So they fight, and in the end, Harold Godwinson was actually shot through the eye by an arrow and killed, and the Normans won control of the English crown. So William the Conqueror comes in, he takes over, he is now the King of England. He unifies all of England under one leader and lays the foundation for a centralized government. That is one government that controls the whole thing. And the English kings from this point on basically have two goals. One, to hold on to the lands that they currently have, because remember, the Normans are French. So hold on to those lands, but to add to them, to strengthen and expand their empire. And to strengthen the power over the nobles and the church. Remember, feudalism, people are looking to their feudal lords, and the church, the Roman Catholic Church, is playing a huge role in people's everyday lives. And the kings want that power. Then in 1154, you have Henry II. Henry II married Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, Eleanor of Aquitaine is a very interesting lady, and when we watch Robin Hood, you'll see her. She was actually the wife of two separate kings. First, she was the queen to Louis VII of France. Aquitaine, if you didn't know, is an area in France. She went with him to the Holy Land during the Second Crusade. She was a very devout wife. However, she didn't produce any heirs. So they had their marriage annulled. And you have to remember that an annulment means that they basically made the marriage go away because divorce isn't allowed in the Roman Catholic Church. So they kind of said, okay, do over. She then married Henry II of England. And through their marriage, Henry and England were able to add on to their territory in France. Together, Henry and Eleanor had 8 children. 2 of them go on to become future kings. Kings, one of whom we've already talked about. The first of her sons to become king was Richard the Lionhearted. Remember, he was the hero of the Third Crusade, the one who made the agreement with the Turks to basically share the Holy Land. The second guy is John, and he's another one that you'll see in the Robin Hood movies, and we'll talk about more in just a minute. So, the accomplishments of Henry II include the use of a jury system, and we have a jury system today, and it's similar to the one that they had during this time period. A jury during this time period is made up of 12 neighbors or people around the accused that would answer the judge's questions about a case. Additionally, he also developed something called the common law, and common law is something that, again, we use today. And what it says is that when a law is, or when a case is decided, that outcome of the case sort of becomes law. And they can look back to these cases and figure out, okay, well, we did this in this particular instance, and now we have another instance that's similar to it. How did we deal with it? This is the tomb of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and this is in France. I just thought this was something kind of cool that you might want to see. This you can actually go and visit. This tomb contains 15 of Henry's relatives, including his sons. Now, one of his sons was King John. Where Richard the Lionhearted was the hero of England, King John was kind of the opposite. Henry was first succeeded by Richard the Lionhearted, but then Richard died on his way back from the Crusades. And this is when King John takes over. He is not a good leader. He is a bad military leader. In fact, his nickname was John Softsword, which nobody wants to be called that. He was cruel. He raised taxes over and over and over again, which we all know how much people love to pay taxes. He also alienated the Roman Catholic Church. He tried to separate himself from the church, which is going to tick off the church too. Because of all of this, the nobility revolted on June 15th in 1215, and they force him to sign what's known as the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. And this is revolutionary. It's a huge, huge deal, because basically what this says is that individuals now had certain political rights, that the king can't basically do whatever he wants to do, no questions asked. And some of the things that came out of the Magna Carta you've probably heard of before, because it becomes the basis of the law system that we have here in the United States. The idea of no taxation without representation. That is, you need to have a representative of the people to decide yay or nay on taxation. That everyone has the right to a jury trial, and everyone has equal protection under the law. Again, this is a huge, huge deal. If it was not for the Magna Carta, the next 700-800 years of English history would be much different. Then we have Edward I. And Edward I builds off of the idea of King John. And he develops the idea of a parliament. And a parliament is that representation. It's similar to our Congress. It's a group of people that make political decisions. And in 1295, you have the first parliament known as the Model Parliament. And it was made up of 4 groups of people. The burgesses, these were like the upper class people, the knights, the bishops, and the lords. And the reason that he came to had these groups come together is because he needed to raise taxes. He needed money to go to war versus the French, the Welsh, and the Scottish. So he needed to raise taxes, and as part of the Magna Carta, he couldn't do so without representation. So he develops this idea of a parliament. The English Parliament is broken down into 2 groups, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the House of Commons is made up of the burgesses, those upper class people, and the knights. And then the House of Lords, which is made up of the nobles and the bishops. Let's jump over to the development of France. The Capetian dynasty, the Capetians are the Capets are the ruling family in France from 987 to 1328. And they started out by being the rulers of a very small territory, which just happened to include Paris. And Paris starts to grow during this time period due to an increase in trade. And as more people are coming through, the Capets become more and more powerful. So let's start by looking at Philip II. And Philip II, in 1204, started to gain territory in France from King John of England. Now, a little background, you may recognize him. He becomes king at 15 and eventually goes on the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade that happened to take place led by Richard the Lionhearted. Now, these guys don't get along. He really, really dislikes the English, and especially the English kings. So much so that, if you remember, on the Third Crusade, he actually gets an argument with Richard the Lionhearted and actually leaves the Crusades, goes back to France. But by 1204, Richard the Lionhearted isn't around anymore. And King John, who is not a very good leader, not a good military leader, remember, John Softsword, he starts to take some of his territory in France. He actually tripled the land under his control during this time period. And one of the things that he did to help establish more representation in government for the individual is he established the idea of bailiffs. And these were people that worked on his behalf, that presided over his court and helped to claim or collect taxes. Then you have Philip IV. Now, Philip IV, he does a lot of things. And one of the things that he's most known for is getting in a fight with the Pope. Now, the Pope said that he would not allow priests to pay taxes to the king. Now, during this time period, one of the biggest landholders in Europe was the Roman Catholic Church, which meant that if the Roman Catholic Church controlled land, they wouldn't have to pay taxes to the king, and the kings didn't like that. So Philip said to the Pope, basically, no, you don't have that right. I'm the king. You need to pay the taxes that I set forth for you. So Philip calls a meeting of his lords and his bishops, and then eventually starts to include his commoners. And his legislative body, similar to Parliament, is known as the Estates General. And the Estates General is made up of 3 different estates. The first estate is made up of church leaders. The second estate is made up by the lords, the upper class nobility, and the third estate is made up of the commoners, wealthy, landowners, merchants, things of that nature. And the Estates General, the way that it worked is that each group got a vote. So the first estate, the second estate, the third estate, each would get a vote, and it was basically best 2 out of 3. Now, in both of these cases, there are steps that need to be taken to allow for the early establishment of democracy in both of these areas. The first step is that you need a centralized government, and the centralized government has to have the ability not just to be able to control a small area, but to control a very large area. And especially in the case of England, they have to be able to control an area that's both on the archipelago of England, but also on the mainland of Europe. The second step is that there needs to be the creation of some kind of law system and court system. That is, if something comes up, there's an issue, they can look back and say, this is how we deal with it. This is allowed, this is not allowed. And the third step is that you need to have the inclusion of the common people in the decision-making process. That is, the individual has to have representation in decision-making, whether that's increasing taxes, going to war, so on and so forth. And all of these ideas start to force a shift from feudalism, where people are loyal to a feudal lord who's using his army to protect the people, to a new idea of nationalism. People aren't loyal to the feudal lord anymore, but instead to a king. And they start to consider themselves to be members of a quote-unquote nation. They're no longer part of this manner or that manner. They are French, or they are Spanish. They are English. So, in a nutshell, that's the development of England and France. Go back to the second slide and make sure that you can answer those last 2 questions. Thanks, and have a great day.